Right, today on Listen Up, we're happy to be joined by Neil Woods. Neil has obviously lived a very fascinating life. You've probably seen him tell his stories on other big podcasts like the James English podcast, going on True Geordie, Sean Atwood's podcast, and he's the author of 2 books, Good Cop, Bad War, and The Drug Wars. And we're very happy to have him on here today. Neil, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
Aye, not too bad. It's not every day we get to speak. I mean, this podcast is going in all sort of different directions. Yesterday, it's like heads of football. The other we spoke to like Brian Cannon, who did the artwork and stuff for Oasis's album covers, and then today, so all different avenues for us in here, but getting there slowly but surely, aren't we?
Yeah, indeed.
But we're here to talk a bit about your story today. Could you sort of explain who you are and what it is you've done in your career?
Yeah, I'm a former police officer, former undercover police officer. So I was in the police for 23 years, but between 93 and 2000, the end of 2006, I spent a good deal of time working undercover, catching drug dealers for a living, essentially. It wasn't the sort of glamorous, high-end undercover work. You know, nothing James Bond like. This was sort of low-level, street-level undercover work where I would mingle with problematic drug users, start buying drugs, and then just try and climb my way up the ladder to get to the sort of local regional dealers by buying increasing amounts of drugs. So that's what I did for a long time. I finally realised that I was actually causing more harm than good, as an understatement, by the work I was doing, and so eventually resigned from the police. And then I joined an organisation called the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is an international organisation that started in the United States. It was already functioning in the UK when I joined. And we are an organisation which campaigns for an evidence-based drug policy. And what that in essence means is that we want a complete end to the war on drugs. And the only way to do that successfully and take the power away from organised crime is to regulate the drug markets. So now I've gone from undercover cop to full-time activist, essentially, writer and activist. Yeah, I think that's a summary of who I am at the moment.
No, definitely, and I think obviously in recent times as well, especially, I think it's been a bit more apparent down south just how much you need the police in this time. Obviously, you've had the Black Lives Matter protests and stuff, and then even here in Glasgow, you had the unfortunate stabbings and stuff at the Park Inn Hotel. It's just this time has really enforced how much we need the emergency services.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you say that, actually, because I mentioned the Black Lives Matter protests, because you know, there is one aspect of Black Lives Matter protests which actually calls for defunding the police, or even in America, there's literally a call to abolish policing altogether and reimagine how the community should keep itself safe. So it's interesting you say that, because that's obviously a very hot debate at the moment, and my colleagues in LEAP in the USA are very much involved in that discussion. But I think you're right. You know, policing is essential, but what we need to try and realise is that the problems that we do have in policing are actually caused by drug policy. The police were completely stitched up when they were given drugs to try and deal with, because it's not a policing issue. You can't have a policing solution to what is just essentially a moral judgment. And it was at the moment when the police were given that to do that problems started. So you mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, racial justice is inseparable from drug policy issues. It's inseparable, absolutely. Drugs are not banned because they're dangerous. There's never been any evidence presented to create the laws for drugs to be banned on any scientific basis. It's got nothing to do with the harms of drugs. It's always been about oppressing minorities. It always has that, and that's why we have our drug laws. So yeah, so if we want to support the police and help the police do a better job, then again it comes back to reforming our drug laws.
One of the things that you said just as you were kind of giving a summary of your career was that you felt you were doing more harm than good. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so bear in mind, I went into working undercover completely believing in the drug war and completely believing in what I was doing, believing that drugs were a scourge on society, and I looked down on people. Really, I had it's quite a standard view of many people in society, and certainly of many police, that if someone has a problem with drugs, it's just because they were stupid enough to try them in the first place, and they haven't got the willpower to get themselves out of it. I was so judgmental. I had such a stigma sort of view of people. Of course, that's complete crap. If people have a problem with drugs, it's because they've got something else going on. 2/3 of problematic heroin users, for example, are self-medicating for some kind of childhood trauma, whether that's neglect, sexual abuse, or physical abuse. And in the post-Jimmy Savile world, where we realise just how many kids get abused, we should be more aware that that there is evidence of where those people go as adults all around us. We see them in city centres, begging. We see them demonised in the tabloid newspapers and called zombies. But these are people who are trying to cope with childhood trauma. But I didn't know that when I started. I didn't know that. I didn't know that the people I was going to be manipulating to get them to introduce me to gangsters, I had no idea that these were people who really needed help. And I'll give you an example, actually, of one that really sticks in my mind, if you like. I was, for a job I did in Nottingham, I've been buying heroin off this taxi driver. Well, he was being driven around by a taxi driver, this dealer. And one day I was going to be driven to the edge of the city where I was going to be arranging to meet this guy. But what I'd found is that the best way I could network is if I really dressed down and really, really looked scruffy. So if I looked like I was the kind of person who was hanging around in squats, or maybe even occasionally homeless, then that opened up more doors than any other way I might look. But this one day, I discovered that to be extra smelly, I would, at the end of each day, I would take off these clothes and put them in a plastic bag, tie it up tight and keep it somewhere warm. So the next day, it really, really smelled. Now, the drug squad people who were dropping me off in the car, they would call me all. They would say, "Oh, you smelly bastard," and winding the window down and just laughing at me. Anyway, so I looked and smelled a mess. That's the point. Anyway, they dropped me off this one day. I was going to meet this dealer, and they dropped me off at the edge of the red light area in Nottingham, which at the time was actually in quite a posh area. It was near where the Goose Fair is held. It's quite a nice area of Nottingham. I started walking on this road, and the road is very curved, so I can't see exactly what's in front of me, but I hear this voice that says, "Sex for sale." I thought, wow, I know it's Nottingham, but it's like 1:30 in the afternoon. That's quite forward, even for Nottingham. Anyway, I carried on walking. "Sex for sale." Still couldn't see her. I carried on walking again. "Sex for sale," I heard. Anyway, I look in front of her and I see her eventually, and I'm walking towards her. And as I walked up to her, she looked me up and down and said, "Cheap? Sex for sale?" So obviously, from my point of view, my outfit worked perfectly. And when I went to the dealer, and I bought some heroin. I did an evidence drop, and later on that day, I bought some crack. And I went back and I told the cops what she'd said, offering me cheap sex, and they laughed. And every cop and most people I tell that to, they laugh. I mustn't have told the story very well today because you didn't laugh, but anyway, the point is most people laugh. And but when I look back on that day, I don't remember what the dealer looked like at all, but I remember exactly what she looked like, because I don't think she was a day over 21. She was tall and slim, and she was holding a kind of special brew. And she was drinking the special brew to try and fend off withdrawal from heroin. And it was the withdrawal from heroin which had taken her to the streets to offer me cheap sex. Now, sex work is not the way to deal with a problematic drug use. And so she needed help, but wasn't getting it. And, you know, all of the money and the training and all of the state's investment was in me to go and catch the dealer. And I just walked past her. You know, I'm the government. I'm the arm of the government. And I ignored her and went after the dealer. But, you know, all those years, I still believed in catching the dealer, thinking that was going to be the problem. That's how I protected people like her. But eventually, you know, you have to face up to the fact that I have had no impact on the drug supply at all, like none at all. Doesn't matter how many people I catch, I've had no impact on it. So, but I did cause harm to individuals and society. So, people that I got to know, vulnerable people who I manipulated, and I used to pick on the vulnerable people to manipulate specifically because they're easier to manipulate, and they generally have more contacts anyway. So more people to introduce them to. So those vulnerable people, the worst thing that could possibly have happened in their life was meeting me, because eventually they're going to be the muppet that the gangsters knew introduced the undercover cop to them. So that's not going to end well, is it? And I knew that going into it. But also, you know, there's so many of them that ended up in prison as a result of the way I manipulated them. So I was causing harm to individuals, for the most part, it's people who needed help that weren't getting it. But also, I was causing harm to society because, you know, the first time I went to buy crack or heroin in Derby back in 1993, it was actually really easy. You know, I was sent to this door, knocked on this door, spoke to this guy. You know, I made up a cover story on the spot. And, you know, when I was walking away, he said, "You take care now, don't get yourself arrested," which I thought was nice, you know, quite pleasant, good advice. But that's the point. It wasn't that difficult to start with because no one knew that tactic was around. You know, it'd been going on in the United States, this kind of low-level undercover work. But for the UK, this was new. And they didn't know that cops were out there catching him like this. So the market wasn't so difficult. And very quickly, a few days' work ended up in a few weeks' work. And then in no time at all, I was doing no less than 6 or 7 months at a time for one operation. And that's because it got more difficult, because they were responding to the tactic. But the thing is, it made it harder for everybody. It made the entire market, the entire scene more dangerous for everybody. Because the most successful gangsters are the ones who can intimidate whole communities. Because if they can intimidate a whole community so that no one grasses them up, or intimidate a whole community so that no one will introduce a stranger, so in other words, to make it harder for an undercover cop, if they can intimidate the community, they are the gangsters that survive. They are the ones that don't get caught. And so over time, you know, these police tactics, the use of informants and the use of undercover cops like me, what it's done is it's created this Darwinian situation where the nastiest survive. And you know, that's never ending. It's a constant issue, like evolution. It's a constant change. So it took me a long time for the penny to drop. You know, I look back and think I was refusing to accept the obvious evidence before my eyes. You know, it took me a long time to finally accept and realize that actually the reason that society was getting more and more violent every year, this world I was stepping into was getting more and more violent every year, was actually my fault. It's a reaction to me and other people like me. And once you realize it, you know, it's not complicated. It's really logical. You know, whenever I explain this to people, they either already understood it, or they go, "Oh, okay, yeah, oh yeah, I get that. Of course, yeah, of course it does that." So it's not complicated, but it still took me 14 years for the penny to drop, So I just had, which is why I do this, I need to try and get other people to realize this a lot quicker than I did, and for society to do something about it. So that was a very long answer to your question, I'm afraid. But
by the way, I think the thing for me is obviously being perhaps a bit younger is that you think of these situations almost like, yes, you're doing a bit of bad, but it's for the overall greater good. But like, if like the mission fails, essentially, that greater good isn't there. You're just sort of causing misery to people's lives who's already probably really distressed.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I used to think that, because I was realizing that I was causing harm to people. There's a guy in Nottingham who introduced me to. You'll have heard this before. I've talked about this a lot before, but it was a guy in Nottingham who I picked on and manipulated, and I spent time listening to his stressors and about his childhood, and really getting to know this guy, and he really opened up to me, and I used that empathy as what I call now as weaponizing empathy. I use that to manipulate him, which is, it's what you do as an undercover cop or a spy or whatever. You use people's weaknesses against them. You use their emotional weaknesses. But the thing is, he was committing offences on bail. When I met him, he was on bail for dealing heroin. That's why one of the reasons he was so useful to me. He was committing offences on bail, which meant that he ended up getting caught. And he actually did 3.5 years. That's what he got sentenced to anyway. But when he was in the police station, he ended up on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch. And the reason for that is because he went suicidal, because from his point of view, in a life that had been really difficult, where a lot of people had let him down, this was the last straw for him, because he thought I was his only friend and the one person in the world he could speak to. And that he hadn't met anyone like me who was so good at making him feel better, Well, yeah, of course I am. These are skills that I honed on the streets for years and years before that. And, that makes me a real weapon in this war. And it makes him the most tragic of casualties. And it's horrendous to think just how many people I actually caused that much emotional distress to, because there's a lot of them. I tell you, I worked hard. I put a lot of people in prison. I manipulated a lot of people. And I'm not the only one. This is still going on. This kind of work still goes on. It didn't end when I ended. So, if anyone's listening, or, if you get the chance to speak to your MP or speak to a councillor or anybody, spread the word, because this isn't right. This isn't right, because any action in policy that causes harm like this, it should be justified, and it should be justified with evidence that there is a reduction in crime as a result. So, police leaders, police and crime commissioners should have to provide evidence that this activity is reducing crime. But I know they won't be able to, because it doesn't reduce crime. It actually increases crime, and we know this. There's good evidence for this. And if you ask any cop anywhere around the world who works on drugs covert policing, if you ask them, when you have a successful series of warrants or a seizure and you catch some dealers, does violence in the community go up or down generally? And even if they're not yet on board with wanting to change drug policy, they'll still grudgingly admit that for the most part, violence goes up, because it's called the freelancer effect. If you take out someone in that market, then you get more than one person competing to control that market, and that inevitably creates violence. And cops understand this all over the world. It's something that we just know because we see the intelligence coming in. We hear what happened, or there's a murder, or there's maimings. These things follow successful police activity. So if we know this in the policing community, it's utterly appalling and outrageous that we still claim arrests of drug dealers and successful seizures as success. It's outrageous, and we need to challenge people. We need to challenge politicians about this. So if there's anyone listening wondering what they can do, well, you can write to your MP and just speak to everyone you can, because, and I do hope that this does convince some people listening. That's why I do this kind of thing. But the way that we win this, the way that we change this and bring about drug law reform is through social movement. And there's historic precedent for this. Homosexuality was illegal. The death penalty was legal. It happened. Now these things changed. They didn't change from political leadership. Political leadership came later. What they changed through social movement, through protest and social movement. So if anyone listening to this agrees that we need to change this and end the drug war, then you are now part of the social movement. And I think you are duty bound to get involved and do something about it, even if it's only being active on social media, sharing the stuff from Leap UK, Transform, Release, things like that. But really, if every single person that had ever listened to a Leap speaker wrote to their MP, that would bring change quicker. So don't think it's a waste of time writing to your MP, because if you're a constituent, they have to pay attention to you.
For me, the area I live in, there's a real problem with drugs. There has been for a long, long time. And one of the biggest problems I tend to find has been that people who need help more than anything, the problem users and people who would typically deal in grams and ounces, they're sucked into this circle of criminality. Whereas the people who are dealing in kilos, it's a career for them, they aren't necessarily in as much need of help, but aren't also caught into the criminality side of it as such. There's more focus on the kind of street level users and dealers.
Yeah, you mean in terms of policing?
Yeah.
Well, that's true, but I suppose that's an aspect of volume. There are more street dealers, but also it's harder to catch the people at the top because they successfully protect themselves with corruption. And actually, it's policing drugs that causes the corruption. Now, that seems a strange thing to say, perhaps, but I'll explain the mechanism. Where police catch dealers, and they do, police are incredibly good at catching drug dealers. They're really good at it. If you gave them twice the resources, they would catch twice as many. If you built twice as many prisons and filled them up, you could fill them up. But it wouldn't make any difference because police never reduce the size of the market. The market stays the same. But the police do change the shape of the market. So by removing some dealers, you get the freelance effect. Sometimes that shakes up the market. But what happens more often is that if you take out a dealer, you make another dealer really, really happy because they can expand their business. They can move into that territory and take over. And what that means is that happy dealer, the one that you've made really happy, is suddenly richer because he's got twice the trade. And that increases. So by thinning out the competition, the police create monopolies. But that means those richer dealers have more money to invest in corruption. And by investing in corruption, it protects them. It means that they're less likely to get caught. So the further up the ladder you are, the richer and bigger a dealer you are, the more likely you are to be safe from prosecution because you've corrupted the system. And we know that this corruption exists. Now, you are fortunate enough to have Frank Matthews coming onto your podcast, aren't you?
Yeah.
There is no one who understands corruption better than Frank. But I'll just give you my slight one of my examples of where I've come into contact with it. The same job in Nottingham where the guy ended up being suicidal. I was sort of investigating the periphery of the Bestwood cartel run by Colin Gunn. Now, I'm not saying I got close to Colin Gunn in that operation, but I got to buy off one of his lieutenants. And yeah, when I got introduced to him, that was horrendous. You know, he interrogated me by pushing a blade into my bollocks, essentially, and feeling that sharp steel in your groin is not very comfortable, I can tell you. So he interrogated me anyway. I eventually got buying off him, and then I was into the guy. He was so unpredictable, though. He was one of the scariest characters I'd met. I remember hearing on the grapevine that because he liked to cut people so much, he was drawing too much attention to himself. So he apparently got taken into a field by Colin Gunn, stripped naked, and had a shotgun put into his mouth to tell him to calm down and stop cutting people. Like that's going to calm him down. So he was a really unpredictable, crazy character. But, you know, he was one of the targets of my operation. I was pleased to get him. Anyway, the day after that confrontation where he'd had that knife where he shouldn't have had, two of my backup team went off sick. And so I got introduced to two new cops. The first one, I shook his hand and, yeah, no problem. I was happy with him. And the second one, I shook his hand and the hairs just went up on the back of my neck. Instantly, he just seemed wrong. And it was difficult to tell exactly in the first instance why. I just knew on an instinctive level. I didn't trust him. And in hindsight, it was probably his body language, the way that he looked down to the floor when he shook my hand rather than keeping eye contact. But I spoke to the guy running the operation and said, look, I do not trust this guy. I'm not having him in the briefing. Can you exclude him? And he was great. He said, yeah, no problem. We'll exclude them both. So there's no questions asked and they'll not know what you're doing. Now, that probably saved my life because 12 months later, when Colin Gunn was brought down.
Can you just sort of explain who Colin Gunn was, just for people who don't know who he was?
Yeah, Colin Gunn basically was the head of the Bestwood cartel. He's one of those gangsters. He was basically trying to take over all of Nottingham, and he was at war with everybody else. He was trying to dominate the entire supply, both in Nottingham and in the region in Derby, right around the East Midlands, apparently. And he was incredibly violent, and he was basically at war with everybody. So at that time, there were shootings in Nottingham almost every day. It was incredibly tense time in Nottingham. In fact, the way the newspapers covered it, it was like headline news quite often about what was going on. My favourite headline from that day, one of the tabloid newspapers, was Shottingham. Quite a good pun, I think.
That is quite good. I'd be quite proud to put that in one of my articles, to be fair. But...
yeah. So he was he was he's a larger than life character. I think the mistake he made was just drawing too much attention to himself, because successful gangsters tend to be the more violent ones, but they're also the ones who can actually stay under the radar to a degree, and that he wasn't doing that. So eventually he got caught in a very sophisticated operation, but it was found because it's 12 months after my operation. It turned out that the cop that I'd taken exception to, that I didn't trust, was an employee of Colin Gunn. He'd been paid to join the police. He was being paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. And he'd been in the police for 7 years by that point. 7 years. In fact, when he was sent to prison, the judge gave him 7 years in prison, which he said was 1 year for every year that he'd been in the police. Now, even though I'd come across corruption a lot as a result of the work that I was doing, I was still fairly stunned by this. And it probably was really close to me potentially getting killed, because in the weeks leading up to that point, Colin Gunn was letting everybody know on the streets, so to make sure that it got back to the cops, that if he caught an undercover cop, he was going to snatch him off the street into the back of a van and torture him to death. You know, so that's the intelligence. The intelligence was saying that's what he intended to do. So my instincts, I think, saved me there. But but I think that, when you've been working undercover almost every day for 4.5 months, your senses are fairly fine-tuned, sort of verging on paranoid, I think. But when I spoke to senior cops after that, and lots of senior cops I've spoken to afterwards since then, they all say, well, of course, we know this happens. We know it goes on, because with this much money involved, how can it not? How can it not happen? And if you think about it, if you've climbed the ladder and you got to a situation where you're that wealthy, then you will, of course, try and protect yourself with corruption. That's the way the drug markets work. It's the way drugs get into prisons. It's the way smuggling happens through West Africa. It's all about corrupting officials. The transit countries in West Africa, they're turning into narco states. They're being corrupted that much by the cocaine route. Guinea-Bissau now is acknowledged as a narco state. It's international cartels run that country, and that's because corruption is caused by drug laws. It's $500 billion of trade every year internationally. It's one of the biggest industries in the world, and it's very successful because corruption is fine-tuned, and you can't defend against it. You can't stop gangsters repeatedly trying to hire people or pay people to join the police or prison service. You cannot protect against that. You can't defend against it because there's just too much money involved. And the way that we police drugs, the way that we do it, makes corruption all the more possible with every passing year.
So how do you think that moving forward we can look at solving this? Is it a case of decriminalisation? Is it legalisation? Is it just better education?
Well, decriminalising possession should happen, of course, like Portugal do, and because it's cruel and counterproductive to criminalise people who use drugs. That is straightforward. The Portuguese evidence shows that drug deaths and bloodborne viruses have dropped dramatically, like incredibly low. We have 60 deaths per million from drugs. Actually, it's more than that now. And Portugal has 3 deaths per million population. So the stark difference shows the evidence. It's very clear that that's what we should do. However, I'm a former cop and I come at this from a policing angle. So decriminalising is not enough. You can't stop there because, you can decriminalise people for possession, but the supply is still being run by gangsters. So it doesn't really solve the greater problems of corruption and crime. So the only solution is legally regulated drug markets. Now, we in the reform world, we tend to avoid the word legalise because it scares people. The scary L word, because it conjures up this idea of a free for all, a surrendering to and it's people picture heroin being sold in corner shops and all this kind of thing. Well, it's not a free for all to change the system. It's a free for all now. Kids can more easily get hold of cannabis, cocaine, MDMA than they can alcohol or tobacco because regulation works. And drug dealers don't ask for ID; they just ask to see your money. So, legal regulation is actually about taking control. That's the point. There is no control now. It's about taking control. And you have different regulation for different drugs. Different drugs have different regulatory requirements. So for heroin's only ever going to be a medical model where you get it from a doctor. It's quite reasonable if someone has a problem with heroin to prescribe heroin to them. It's actually, the evidence shows that it's actually the most successful harm reduction measure and treatment system is to actually prescribe people heroin and give them counselling and look after them while they're doing that. On the other end of the spectrum, drugs like cannabis, well, we just need basic regulation to decide where it can be sold, by whom and to whom. So it means just an age limit, photographic ID. At Leap, we would prefer a public health approach to that. So we would have no branding, no advertising, plain packaging.
Largely like cigarettes just now.
Yeah, absolutely. Although personally, I would not have any restriction on the different types of cannabis. So I would not have a cap on the level of THC, for example. I know a lot of allies of mine would disagree with me on that. They would say that for a health reason, you should have caps on these things like they do in Canada. But for me, that would leave too much of an illicit market functioning. And if people want a product, you need to be able to provide it for them. You can maybe make very high THC products more expensive, use those kind of regulatory measures, but you've got to allow people the choice. And to be honest, surveys and studies suggest that it's something like 80% of cannabis consumers prefer a mild product or a balanced product, a balance between THC, CBD. So most people would only have the milder products anyway. So, and at the moment, people are frustrated because a lot of people can't get mild products. They can only get a very high THC strains with virtually no CBD in it. And, a lot of people really don't want that. They want better quality, or rather a more balanced product. And then you've got all the other drugs in between, MDMA. Now, MDMA is an important example of the disasters of prohibition, because it's a drug that's clearly, like most of them, it's not banned because it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's banned. Because the deaths that you have from it are either because it's not MDMA, it's something else, it's PMA, or it's 4 times too strong in a tablet. And regulation tackles those issues. I want to see MDMA in a blister pack, measured to the appropriate dose, with instructions on the side, clear information, clear education, and a licensed pharmacist to talk through the use of it with somebody if they so wish. And you will quickly see that MDMA is a remarkably safe drug. And I think that as a society, if people want to dance in a field to repetitive music, we should be not only allowing that, but maybe encouraging that, and making sure it's done as safely as possible. And as a lover of dance music, support the culture. That's what I say.
Social distancing and all that, remember. But I think this time last year, I wouldn't have been old enough to buy a drink. Right? I was still only 17, so I don't do drugs or that, right? But people obviously my age do, and I know more people that do drugs that don't do drugs at my age, sort of between early teenage, early 20s. And when we were sort of 16, 17, the issues that would probably go through some heads is, right, we're going to a party. Is it easier for me to get an adult to go into the shop and buy me a 4-can Stella, or is it easier to phone my local drug dealer and just get them to show up at the door and post stuff through the door? It's the latter option every time. And I think if you flip it the other way and there's the restrictions on drugs like there is with alcohol, it's probably a completely different scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the point, isn't it? It is substantially easier, and actually for most drugs it's much cheaper, because the price of MDMA has just collapsed. It's like dirt cheap at the moment. It's astonishing how cheap it's gone. So yeah, it is, regulation is about control, and it's about protecting young people, and that's the responsibility of government, is to protect its citizens. And this policy is catastrophically failing to do so. We have the highest drug deaths in Europe, well, particularly in Scotland, definitely has the highest drug deaths in Europe, because Scotland is even worse than the rest of the UK. And on a political point, I think Scottish citizens should be outraged that Westminster is not allowing Scottish government to take its own measures on drug policy, because the Scottish government has been looking into evidence for ways of reducing those drug deaths, and is being prevented from bringing those measures in by Westminster policy. Now, I don't want to get into party politics. I'm not advocating supporting the SNP over other parties or at all, but it is an outrage that there is evidence-based solutions for example, drug consumption rooms, that the Scottish government wants to bring in, and they're prevented to from a central drug policy. So, in my view, drug policy should be devolved. And if it was devolved, you would quickly find less Scottish people dying. And I think that's an important point to make.
Definitely. I mean, the drug consumption rooms is very much something that's been a hot topic up here for a while. And it's something that I wholeheartedly agree with, just because of the bloodborne viruses, needle sharing and everything else, the risks that come with that. And I just feel that it's very much a war that's been lost, the war on drugs. I think just now it's the finger in the dike trying to stop the inevitable flood that's coming, and looking at the deaths in Scotland, it's something needs to be done.
Absolutely.
One thing as well, do you think, in your time in the police, do you think we're closer now to changing than we were when you first joined the police?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, it's been interesting to see just how much influence we've been having at Leap UK, along with our allies, particularly in the shift in police culture and the approach of police leaders. Now, in England and Wales, we have the police and crime commissioners, and I hated the idea of police and crime commissioners when they were brought in 2010. I didn't support them at all. I thought it was a terrible idea, and that it would risk politicising policing. But it's actually turned out to be one of the best possible things for drug policy, because it's given elected officials the chance to actually shape some of the drug policy locally in the way that they choose policing priorities. And one of the members of Leap UK who died last autumn, sadly, Ron Hogg, who was the Police and Crime Commissioner for Durham, good friend of mine, fantastic man, he very publicly stated that his police would no longer be actively seeking people for drug possession. They would not be looking for people for cannabis. They would not be doing cannabis warrants. And this was shocking initially, and got in the newspapers. But then, as over sort of 4 years or so, whenever he spoke drug policy, there was no response in the media or journalism. There was no pushback, particularly from the establishment. And people like him and Alvan Jones in North Wales, David Jameson, who was the West Midlands PCC, all progressive people. Now, this has changed the political landscape in terms of drug policy, completely changed it. And, the advocacy that we do, the meetings we have with MPs, it seems like every other month we have a new MP who's a supporter. It's astonishing now how many politicians are share our views. And now you have some fantastic Scottish advocates. The best, my favourite, my friend Ronnie Cowan, who was the MP for Inverclyde. He's a fantastic spokesperson for evidence-based drug policy. He's really, really good, and he works very hard on this. In England, you have the Labour Drug Policy Reform Group, led by the MP Jeff Smith. You have the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group, led by Crispin Blunt, MP. And you have some good Plaid Cymru. Obviously, the Greens have a superb drug policy. And, only 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, you couldn't have imagined this, the scale of just how much support there is now politically. You couldn't have imagined it. If you'd said to me 5 years ago that in the same year I would be speaking at the SNP, Conservative and Labour conferences, I would have laughed at you. Honestly, I would. I would have thought that's just pie in the sky, ridiculous. We will never be that mainstream. I would have said to you. But last year I was at those conferences, and those events were really well attended. the issues were enthusiastically embraced by good and influential people, and changes are really happening. And the most significant political shift happened during the speech of Jonathan Ashworth, who is the Shadow Health Secretary at the Labour conference. And this is huge. He actually made the statement in his conference speech that drug policy should sit with the Department of Health and not the Home Office. Now that is massive, because there is no health spokesperson from the main parties ever said that, and it's been called for a long time. But that's a major milestone. Now, Scotland again is ahead of England with this, because that announcement is, that statement's already been made in Scotland. But for the Labour Party to make that statement is massive, and especially as that statement was made when Corbyn was leader. Keir Starmer came in and kept him in post. So that is at least a passive indication that he supports that stance. And if you look at Starmer's front bench as well, you've got Eric Miliband, who is a reformer in business. You've got Thangam Debonair, who was the co-founder of the Labour drug policy reform movement. She's now Shadow Minister for Housing. A drug law reformer in charge of housing. That's a perfect overlap. That's drug policy. That's a drug policy issue. So I know Rebecca Long Bailey's just been sacked, but she's a reformer, drug law reformer. There's so many in that shadow cabinet are reformers. So I wonder. It's exciting, because you think, well, what's going to come next? Is there going to be a proposal from Miliband that the way out of this financial crisis is a regulated cannabis market? Or, it's not beyond the realm of possibilities, because that is a logical thing to do. And, you've got Boris Johnson's, one of his close advisors, Blair Gibbs, his job before being his advisor was as a cannabis reform advocate. That's the world he came from. So there's all sorts of indications that things are coming into place, but obviously we'll need to get rid of Priti Patel first, I think.
It's funny you mentioned a potential regulated cannabis market as a way out of the kind of coronavirus stuff, because I was actually going to question you on that. Looking at the revenues generated in the US as states are now moving towards full legalisation, it's been incredible sums of money that's been brought into their treasuries, and it would be a fairly natural step to make here to at least move towards some sort of regulated market.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is logical. And there's actually a brilliant report by the Institute of Economic Affairs, which actually used to be Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tank. They're very right. But they did this fantastic report on the potential revenue of the UK cannabis market. And they estimate the value in the current market at 2.5 billion a year. Now, that's an enormous amount of money that could come into Treasury each year. But there are difficulties in bringing that kind of dialogue into the UK, though, because in the US, there's some data which shows that where people voted for regulating the cannabis market, the majority of them did so with the potential tax revenue, the money from it, as one of the main reasons. But the British sensibility is different from the Americans. So if I speak to a room full of 100 middle-class people, and I was to start selling the idea of regulating the cannabis market for the financial benefit, the audience would turn against me just like that. Because what they're thinking as parents is, how dare you put the safety of our children down to money? So you have to have a different discussion in the UK. You can't present the money value as the first benefit. You have to emphasise the child protection. But the truth is, it is logical that it could be a huge, huge boost to the UK economy, because you are taking the money away from criminals and legitimising it. But there is another risk, though. And the risk is that if you bear in mind that drug policy has been marginalising people for decades, there is a risk at the point where you regulate the cannabis market that those marginalized people get even further left behind. Because for some people in some communities, they can feed their kids because they're selling cannabis. You know, in some communities, that's the that's the dark economics, the illicit economics that keeps people going, and keeps kids' bellies full. You know, because we do have lots of child poverty, and if we regulate the wrong way, that's going to be giving a great business to people who are already rich and making some communities even poorer. So it has to be done with equity in mind. It has to be done by investing in people who really would benefit from this in communities. So I would say that at the point we regulate cannabis, anyone for the conviction for cannabis, it needs to be wiped straight away. People, we need to have, we have to have straight away, we have to have a scheme where people who have had convictions can have a priority or a government loan or some kind of business investment, low interest, whatever it is, some kind of way in investing in people who have been marginalized by these laws. And we have to do that because we're going to fail society unless it's done equitably. And it's going to be disastrous to make inequality even worse if it's just another business given to the rich people. And it is a risk. It's a huge risk. So when cannabis regulation does come, that is the issue that I'll be campaigning hardest on.
I think I've learned two things for that bit of dialogue. One, I'm doing a podcast with a felon, and two, that 420 could soon become an actual legal public holiday by the sounds of it. I mean, I think as well, one of the things that I find is that there's a really big stigma behind all types of, even though there's a lot of people that obviously do drugs and things like that, there's still an enormous stigma behind it. And you've obviously experienced that firsthand. I don't know if you can expand upon it. But I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why it has been so long for change, because I think people have almost sort of tried to wash their hands of it a wee bit, almost like some of these people are they're all marginalised as criminals almost.
Yeah, but we have to remember though, it's the law that's created that stigma. It's the law that's created that marginalising. It's the law that means that people can look at a particular group of people and just see them as other than human. It was the same, as I mentioned earlier, that it's the same with laws against homosexuality. It was made illegal by a moralizing minority. And, that allows a dialogue, a propaganda, it allows misinformation, prejudice to fester and get worse. And the thing is, the propaganda for drugs it's just, when you look into it, it's just appalling. It's everything about drugs, from society, from journalism, from media, from politicians. It's simply not true. So most people's understanding of drugs and drug use is based on ridiculous misconceptions. But most middle-aged people who have not had anything to do with drugs will take the view that anyone who uses a drug has got a problem with it, whereas 90% of drug use is non-problematic, and even the 10% of drug use that is problematic, it's a sliding scale. Most of that 10%, they just need a small amount of help, or most of that 10% actually, most people who do have a problem with drugs, they just grow out of it. Their life changes and that problem ends. So it's the small amount of people who actually need intervention and treatment. But looking after those people and investing in treatment is significantly cheaper than policing drugs or locking people up. Just put people a year in prison, it costs £45,000. That's significantly more expensive than any kind of drug treatment, even the most expensive of drug treatment. So, the logic is there. It's not that complicated, but the stigma's created by policy. It's written into the system.
I mean, just to build on the stigma just a little bit, I mean, to go a little bit further back, you look at in America, what they call cannabis marijuana, simply because it's a Mexican sounding name, so people have that natural distrust of it. And it just shows just how there's been this long standing, conspiracy is maybe not the right word, but there's been a long standing attempt at kind of sullying the name of drugs and drug users to paint this black mark against them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the same for the other drugs as well. I mean, you mentioned in America they changed the name from cannabis to marijuana to make it sound more foreign, like those other people use. But that was about the Great Depression, where there was mass unemployment and Mexicans were seen as coming stealing white jobs. So it was just good old-fashioned racism. But it's not just cannabis. I mean, it's the same for cocaine, opium. You know, opium was banned because it was a way of persecuting Chinese immigrants. That they'd got Chinese immigrants to build the railways. When the railways were finished, there was 100,000 or so Chinese immigrants that white people just didn't like. So that's why they persecuted them for what they saw as Chinese behaviour. It's the same for cocaine. No one had a problem with middle-aged white women using cocaine. But when Southern black people were seen to be using it, that was yet another way of persecuting and arresting black people. So without racism, those drugs would not have been made illegal.
Even methadone was the same.
What, sorry?
Even methadone was the same. Introduction to the methadone program, it was kind of the upper and middle classes being worried about getting the same stuff that the lower class junkies were getting. The whole AIDS explosion.
Yeah, that's true. Even alcohol, actually. Alcohol prohibition is also about prejudice. That was basically the Protestant Puritan political power base fearing the influx of Catholic immigrants, and Catholic immigrants were seen to be the people who drank. So they banned alcohol, and the biggest supporter of banning alcohol was the Ku Klux Klan. They were the bankrollers behind that policy because they hated Catholics even more than they hated black people, perhaps. So yeah, but it's interesting what you pointed out about the use of the word marijuana. One of the few loudmouths who still rant about cannabis in the UK, Peter Hitchens. Whenever you hear him on TV or radio or whatever, he insists on using the marijuana word, which I think is quite a clear indication of his views that he chooses to do that.
Who is this guy? I haven't heard of him. Can you is he like a political?
Hitchens is mental.
Or what is it he does?
He's a very successful Daily Mail columnist. He also appears in all sorts of TV news commentary type programs. I debated him on a Sunday morning politics program on BBC. He gets on Question Time quite a lot. He has the reputation of an intellectual, someone who approaches things from a sort of intellectual, historic standpoint. But on drug policy, he's just got this weird, prejudiced, moralising view. In that he says that all drug use is immoral. It's wrong. And he looks at it from a purely religious point of view. We in the drug policy world we don't debate him anymore because it's pointless. There's no point giving him the oxygen because he doesn't refer to evidence. He just shouts, and he shouts people down, and he does all of this fear mongering. He comes out with all this nonsense about cannabis causing violence, and whenever there's a terrorist attack, he makes the suggestion that it's because they use cannabis. And it's, you think, well, this is just batshit crazy, and it is batshit. It's completely crackers. But the trouble is, people who are moralising and want to look down on people, it really feeds into their prejudices, and it'll slow down reform, but he'll lose eventually.
Anyway, I want to take it back a bit, just sort of to a bit about your career undercover. Would you be able to sort of expand on like a store of one of your more? I know, and I've got family links down in Northampton, and I know that was obviously an area you worked in. I don't know if you can sort of expand upon your stories from that time in your life.
Yeah, you say you've got family in Northampton.
Well, it's my dad's side of the family, and we're all. I don't know if you're. There's still some that live down in Northampton. I think the village name is fucking hilarious. It's called Toaster.
Right. Yeah.
I used to have a fucking big laugh because I've still got aunties and stuff that live down there. But we've been down a couple of times and things, and it was when I was sort of listening to podcasts you've been on and your books and things, and it always cropped up. I was like, because I've been to Northampton and it's quite an unassuming place. It's quite.
Yeah, you would think so, wouldn't you?
But then when I was reading this, I was like, whoa, what is going on?
Well, the thing is, you think, you look at the place and it's a large town. There are cities smaller than Northampton. I live in Hereford. It's smaller than Northampton and it's a city. But yeah, Northampton's, it's a big town. And you think, well, it's just an unassuming town. There can't be much going on here. But what I'm going to describe to you that went on in Northampton is it's happening literally everywhere. There isn't a town that size or smaller that doesn't have the same issues. It's literally ubiquitous, and people need to realise this. It's everywhere. So I actually had given up undercover work at the point where I was asked to do Northampton because I found it too emotionally taxing, and that was after the guy who went suicidal. I just found it too distressing. But then I got the phone call, and I was persuaded to do this one, and it was explained to me. They said, look, Woodsy, we need you to do this job. We've had 2 people try already, and they've not got close. And we need you to catch these ones because they're even more violent than the last gangsters you had dealings with. This crew are using gang rape as part of their intimidation. They're doing all the other gangster stuff as well. They're maiming people and kidnapping people and all that kind of stuff. But, they're a step up. And they were a gang called the Burger Bar Boys, who were based in Birmingham. I think it's just less than an hour drive in the daytime. Yeah, something like that. So it's not too far. But the reason that the Burger Bar Boys had taken over Northampton is actually because Northamptonshire police had a load of success. And this is the way that it works. Northampton had locked up their local heroin dealers, leaving a brief gap in the market. Freelancer effect, the big boys from Birmingham moved in. So 6 of them were the people running the show. But basically they turned up, and any existing dealers, people trying to run in the market, they basically took over and said, right, work for us. And that's the way it works. They intimidated their way to be in charge. So I went into that, and basically I spent a few weeks manipulating a couple of people, getting to know them, and I knew this was going to be a pretty tough job, so I had to really build a decent legend. So what I did, I made myself out to be a travelling shoplifter, did some shoplifting with some people, which is great fun. It really is.
How do you believe that if you're like police? Do you then go out and arrest yourself? Or?
Well, I mean, the thing is that the way the law works and the way that I approached it was I was never actually committing theft because I never intended to permanently keep the property I was taking. So that's the get out of jail free clause for me. But anyway, it was good fun. But what I did is then I got to know this couple, and I got them to introduce me to all the people who could buy stuff. So if I had spirits to sell, I needed to know who to go to. If I had baby clothes, which you can always sell baby clothes, by the way. So if you do want to get into shoplifting, I'm not advising it, but if you do, then, the kids grow up so fast, don't they? So there's always a demand for clothes, especially in poor communities. So I needed to be introduced to all of these people who would buy stuff from me. That got me a reputation so that people could fact check me. And then anyway, after a few weeks, this guy agreed to introduce me to what he referred to as the Brummies. So he took me to this snooker club where they sort of held court, really. Got directed into the toilets, and then this hooded figure came in, went into the cubicle, stood on the toilet, looked over the top of the cubicle and said, "What's this?" Then the door burst open again, and these 4 hooded figures came in and started walking around me, every so often headbutting me on the side of the head and punching me in the ribs. And all the time they were doing that, he's asking me questions and he's asking my mate questions. And he's sort of rephrasing the questions and trying to catch me out. And, you know, I was just quickly coming to the conclusion that I wasn't going to walk out of there in one piece. You know, my ears were starting to hurt and from the bashes on my head. And I just thought, you know, I know what these people do. They're just going to leave me in a bloody mess. Anyway, just as I was thinking it was about to happen, then he said, oh, all right then. And as soon as he said that, the 4 people just walked out. They'd never said a word. They just walked out. And then he said, yeah, go on then, what do you want? So I said, oh, 1 and 1, please. So I bought 0.4 of heroin, 0.4 of crack, gave him 40 quid, got his phone number. And then I was into them. I was into that team. And that was the most important point. So I ended up, you know, buying drugs regularly from them, building evidence of conspiracy. So I learned about their routines, obviously noted all the numbers that they were with. And over the space of 7 months, there was evidence gathered against 96 people in that operation, which you'd think, you know, for a town of the size of Northampton, that's a lot of people, and maybe it is. But I knew there was no one else to meet. No one else to meet at all. There was no phone number I hadn't got. There was no one that was dealing that I hadn't met. We were pretty sure what days they were bringing the drugs in, what route, where the stash houses were. And so the job came to an end and they used police from 5 different counties. 5 different counties of cops helped with that. It was a massive job, huge raids. And I spoke to the intelligence guy who was keeping his ear to the ground a week or so, maybe was it a week or 2 weeks after those raids. And he said to me, yeah, we managed to shut down the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 2 hours. Now, that's 7 months of work, 96 people arrested, 6 of them the major gangsters, the Burger Bar boys. I thought I was going to die twice on that job. You know, one day they stripped me, showed me a gun and said strip, because they said, you're 5'0", man, you're 5'0", you're wearing a wire. Thankfully, I decided not to wear a wire that day. But, you know, I thought I was going to die. All that work, long hours, God knows how many drugs I bought, just to interrupt the drug supply for 2 hours. Now, thinking about it, now I don't know this for certain, but I can picture the scene. I can imagine that the rivals of the Burger Bar boys, infamous rivals, who called the Johnson crew. Now, the Johnson crew and the Burger Bar boys have been at war off and on for a long time, and you know their sport is shooting each other. But you can just imagine the rivals, the Johnson crew, the celebration when they heard what the police had done for them. They'd have been jumping up and down and shouting, yes. They'd have said, put the call in, boys, we're going to make a fortune, because you know, it gives them the opportunity to expand their business, move in, and nothing changes. And in fact, the people above them in the ladder, above them in the pyramid, they probably are the people who supply both sides, the Burger Bar boys and the Johnson crew. So if you seize a load of drugs from one, and the other team moves in and buys another load of drugs for the same marketplace, so the people above them in the chain gets to supply that market twice, at least for that period of time. So actually, you've increased the trade for those people making the most money from it. And you know, you can see this in announcements on police social media pages, or the National Crime Agency, or the regional organised crime intelligence units, or wherever it is, or Police Scotland. A few years ago, they started using this word, disrupt. We must disrupt the activities of drugs organised crime. We have a duty to disrupt it. They use this kind of word in press releases. And that's sort of an admission, really, that they're not reducing the market, because disruption is not reduction. So it's a sort of admission. But the real craziness behind using that word, they've not clicked yet, because it's astonishing. If you listen to any business lecture from big successful business people like Richard Branson, they use the word disrupt, and they make the point that if you want to stimulate a market and create market opportunities, then you have to disrupt that market. And this is an understanding in business, and that's what they talk about: ways of disrupting the market to create opportunity. And so the police are, without irony, using this word without truly understanding what it means, because what they're talking about is disrupting a market. But disrupting a market creates opportunities and makes the market grow. There's a disconnect, and people need to understand what's going on. It's not complicated, but we have to be talking about this, and we have to be challenging it. And that's up to all of us. That's up to all of us that do understand this. We have to be spreading the word and explaining to other people who don't yet get it, because that's social movement. If you manage to persuade 2 people in a year who didn't understand previously, and you say to them, well, if you do get this, no, it's up to you too. That's social movement. That's the social movement in action. We've been looking at the R number, haven't we, in briefings from Nicholas Sturgeon or people in Westminster, and they've been talking about what the R number is, and it's theoretically below 1. Well, I think that with the amount of people who are involved or support the drug policy reform movement, I think we can get the R number much higher than that if we just challenge each other to persuade people and present the evidence in a calm and reasonable way. And I don't mean trying to convince people that cannabis cures cancer, because even if you believe that, please don't go around telling people that, because that's really damaging to the whole movement, because most people just think, don't talk bollocks. So what we should always do in our advocacy is use evidence that the other person can invest in, evidence that the other person will reasonably accept, the common sense stuff about policing, the kind of stuff I've been talking about. And if we challenge each other and challenge other people to we can make that number grow and make the social movement grow.
Yeah, definitely. It just sounds like a vicious cycle, really, what you've described. You know what I mean? One drug group gets into power. Because the thing is, as well, even though you might be eliminating drug groups and new ones are coming in, I suppose the sort of customer base is never diminishing. You know what I mean? I think that's perhaps the problem, and it's not an easy fix, really, is it?
Well, no, because people will always take drugs. They always have, and they always will. And different people like different drugs. A lot of people who consume cannabis, some people consume cannabis because they found that alcohol doesn't suit them. They've tried cannabis and they prefer cannabis. Then I've met loads of people that's the route that they've gone. And does that make them different, or does that make them deviant? If the moralists are saying that makes you deviant. Well, that is such bollocks that we really have to be challenging that. Some people don't drink, but they like to dance in a field occasionally on MDMA. Does that make them different or deviant? It's just, we just have to challenge these preconceptions. And as you say, people will always take drugs. They always have. It's part of the human condition. It's natural. It's normal. It's normal to want to change that software for a little while. It's not just humans that do it. Animals do it right across the animal kingdom. There's some types of apes which they'll not touch the fruit on the tree until it's fermented into alcohol. Certain trees, or there's an interesting one actually. Water buffalo in Vietnam, they only started eating poppies when the bombing was going on in Vietnam, and when the bombing stopped, they stopped. It's a natural response to circumstances, whatever those circumstances are. People use drugs either to relax from a situation, or in some people's cases to help deal with trauma. And as Carl Hart says, a professor at Columbia University, drug use is normal, but it's also, most drug use is rational. And it tends to be a rational response to whatever circumstances people find them in, whether that's dealing with trauma or just a way to relax. It's rational. So that rational thought and rational decision making, in the end, it comes down to liberty. It comes down to the freedom to do what we want with our mind and our body. If we want to climb a rock and risk ourselves that way, then that's our choice, isn't it? And it has to be the same with drug policy. It can't be separated from other risky behaviours. It should not be.
Do you ever find that, James, sort of obviously, like, if you're just openly admitting to being a felon, then you won't mind me asking this, then let's see, obviously, like, Neil talking, like, people maybe feel like deviance and stuff. Have you ever felt like that with stuff?
Not so much personally, but very much that people have that perception of me. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think there's certainly some people that think that because you do whatever, that you're the worst kind of people, and it's nowhere near true.
I think that's the general perception a lot of people have, and I know I've already spoke about it, but I think you'll never break that in some folk. Obviously, we've talked about the Daily Mail commentator. You're never going to break that in some folk. I think you need to appeal to the rational audience that perhaps are like, don't know, you call them something politics, can't mind the word for it anyway, but you can change their opinion. Perhaps they're not quite sure what side of the fence to sit on, and you can change their opinion rather than going for the ones that are already at their side of the fence.
Yeah, a good friend of mine described the system in terms of persuading police, but it works in wider society as well. He said there's a third that already get it, and there's a third that will never get it, but there's a third that could get it if it was explained properly. So what we have to do is to encourage the third that already get it to persuade the third that are undecided until the people who do get it outnumber the people who don't. And that's democracy, isn't it? And that's the way social movement works. So it comes down to that exponential thing. So yeah, there's always going to be some people. I mean, there are some people out there, still a few left, who are fiercely prejudiced against homosexuals. But, with every passing year, it becomes less socially acceptable to be prejudiced against homosexuals. The homophobic jokes that went on the TV in the 70s and 80s, you look back now and it's cringeworthy. It's like icky. It's horrible. But that's within my living memory. Things have shifted. So things can shift with drugs. They can. We have got cause to be optimistic because we have examples of societal shifts in other things. We could be looking back in 20 years in horror in the way that we saw people who use different drugs. So, we have to be optimistic. We can change things.
I think that would just be the case with a lot of things. I was watching a film the other weekend. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Summer Holiday. Right. It's this really old film, right? It's got Cliff Richard in it.
Oh yeah.
I saw it as a kid, yeah.
But see some of the stuff that's in it, like the total the total sexually orientated stuff in it, like women and things like that. It's just like there's so many things like that now that you can't get away with for the better. And I wonder, how will you look on that thing from the early 70s in 30 years' time? You know what I mean? It's just, and even with talking about the Black Lives Matter things and that, and blackface being taken out of Little Britain's one that been obviously highlighted in the media as well, and it's interesting to see how these things are changing.
A really good one to go back and watch, Ben, would be to go back and watch the original American Reefer Madness movies and see how the attitudes have changed from what those were to what it is today.
What are those films?
Those were American public service films, essentially decrying the use of marijuana because it would turn you into a red-eyed rapist. It was madness.
See, this is all before my time.
Yeah, Reefer Madness is a really wacky film. It's really dark. Yeah. But, you know, there's people still ranting in those kind of wacky terms, aren't there? There's the Cannabis Causes Violence Brigade. I mean, that is the craziest of all the claims. You know, as a former cop, you ask any cop that's ever worked with drugs, ask them which drug it is that's a problem for violence, and it's alcohol. You know, in 23 years, I never came across anybody who caused any problems with violence under the influence of cannabis. Now, I know that's a subjective view rather than objective evidence, but thankfully, the objective evidence also backs me up there.
Would you be able to tell us, just as we get to the end of this, sort of what your last operation was as an undercover cop?
My last occupation?
Yeah, no, like your last job, pretty much.
Well, that was in Brighton, and that was pretty grim because, for a few reasons. Whenever I'd worked undercover around the country, I'd generally worked with really professional, decent cops, and I went to Brighton, and it was an unpleasant working environment, a very bullying sort of culture, just unpleasant cops who, you know, when there was another heroin overdose, they would make reference to, they would just say, oh, well, shoplifting will go down, there's another one bites the dust. You know, they were just awful. And the problem is as well that they've been using the undercover tactic way too much and in much too simpler terms without much flexibility or development. So what that had allowed the local dealers to do, and I say local because it wasn't local, it was 3 gangs supplying Brighton, one from London, one from Birmingham, and one from Liverpool. And it was such a lucrative market because there were so many problematic heroin users there that they were travelling all the way from Liverpool. It's much the same as it is now, really, with sort of county lines dealing. But what this had allowed them to do is the dealers had basically started using homeless people as proxy dealers. And what they would say to those homeless people is, you do all of the dealing for us, you bring all of the money, and we do the deal all in one go, and you don't bring anyone else close to us. And if you do bring anyone else close to us, we'll kill you. Now, I can't say that there were casual murders going on because that would take a full police investigation to do so. But what I can say is there were a significant number of people who were very convinced that there had been casual murders. Now, at the time, Brighton had the highest drug deaths per capita in the country by a long way, like a long way. They were way ahead of their rivals in Blackpool for the drug deaths. I say rivals with dark humour, obviously.
I was a bit here. I was like, what?
Yeah, so it was believed that some of those deaths were casual murders in order to control the homeless population into behaving, just giving them overdoses. So the fear on the streets was so tangible at that, you know, at that snapshot, at that period of time when I was there. It was so tangible and it was so dark that eventually I realised that this was a vision of the future, that this is the inevitable way that organised crime would respond to an increase in police activity. And I realised just how much worse things are going to get. And I suppose it was a bit of a premonition because there's something like this happening now, except that organised crime are not using homeless people anymore. They're using children. And that was the next development. So when you talk about county lines, the exploitation of children by drugs organised crime, it's as a result of police tactics. It's because of police success. It's because of people like me. And it's because of the use of police informants. Because children are the perfect strategic response to that police success. They're the perfect buffer zone between dealers and police. It protects the dealers. And children are easily disposable. There's a plentiful supply of them. They're cheap labour. and they're easy to manipulate. So, and this is something we need to admit as a society. We need to be spreading the word and making people realise that, 40 years ago, drug dealers would never have considered the idea of using children. In fact, most of them would be offended if you said that this is going to happen eventually. This has happened as a result of policy. It's happened as a result of police success. This is what happens. The drug war is an arms race. The police get good at catching dealers, and drugs organised crime respond with tactics to fight the police strategy. So, you would think that the use of children being exploited would be the Armageddon moment, the moment where we change direction. But unfortunately, the Home Office at the moment is just doubling down and promising to arrest more and more people. In fact, they announced they were building 4 new prisons to increase the prison population by 10,000. Now, I think that is actually because they anticipate arresting more people to try and tackle county lines. I think that move is about county lines. Because they think they need to step up activity, and that arresting the way out of the problem is the way forward, but it won't. All that will happen is that will increase the violence in the streets. You increase the jeopardy on the streets, you increase the violence in response, because the most successful dealers are the ones who can most successfully intimidate the communities in which they operate. So it's looking grim, I'm afraid.
No. Just when you children as well, I'm assuming like when children are involved, your procedure as law enforcement then gets more complicated as well, because obviously it's all to do with them being under 18 and things like that.
Well, the most important tactic that police use in the drug war is the use of informants, CHIS, covert human information sources, spies. And one of the reasons that gangsters use children is because it makes it much harder for police informants to infiltrate those groups, because informants tend to be adults. So the police are now trying to recruit children. And the law as it stands means that they could recruit a 16-year-old and they don't have to have a responsible parent, an adult, there to look after the interests of that child. Whereas if a child was arrested at that age, they would have to have an appropriate adult to look after their interests. Now, I don't know what you were like when you were 16, but I was fairly impressionable. And I think I could have been very easily manipulated. And so the drive to recruit more children as CHIS, as informants, is going to end disastrously, because the more that organised crime become aware of the police drive to recruit more children, the more organised crime will use blanket intimidation on all of the children involved, which will mean more beatings, more blackmail, and more grim behaviour to intimidate and abuse those kids, to stop them talking to the police, to scare them into not talking to the police. So
my sister's around about that age, and I'm only 2 years out from being 16. And you need, I think as well, perhaps I'm just talking from one person's circumstances, but I've obviously had doing stuff like this and things like that, I'm perhaps a wee bit more informed. But I know the vast majority of people round about my age, like, I think as well that the chances of things going wrong with them is also probably higher, because, as you say, they are much more impressionable and more open to ideas, especially if they're threatened in any way.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the police who are source handlers, they are good at their job. That's why they're in their position. They are good at persuading people to help the police and become a CHIS. That they're good at it, but they should not be used for children. And it comes back down to this same point I said at the beginning. We should be challenging policy to say, well, if you're doing this, where's the evidence it's reducing crime? Because there is clearly no evidence that there's crime being reduced, because we wouldn't have got to the point where children are now being exploited if it did work. If policing drugs worked, we wouldn't be in this mess. We wouldn't have children exploited. I I spoke to a Scouser who had been exploited as a county lines dealer, and he used to go make trips up to Aberdeen from Liverpool because Aberdeen is a very lucrative market, and Aberdeen is fought over because it's such a lucrative market. And this is an appalling situation that Police Scotland can do nothing about. They cannot stop Liverpudlian or Birmingham gangs dealing in their territory. They can't do it. Because if they catch a kid, it just mean another one's recruited or another one's sent up. So we have to regulate. And I fear that things will get a lot worse before politicians get completely behind the idea of full regulation. But we have to be persuading them. We have to be pushing that agenda, I think.
I think for the general public, I think that message will be quite hard to understand. Like, you're the police, you can arrest people and things like that. But for the normal person, like, it's hard to understand why police can't just go and arrest someone. You know what I mean?
Well, the way to explain to people is you have to see drug crime completely different to any other kind of crime. If a police officer arrests a burglar in a town of 50,000 population, say, for example, then burglaries will go down because there are a limited number of people in that community that are willing to commit that crime. So arresting that person reduces crime. There's clear evidence of that. If you arrest the drug dealer, crime goes up because there's an infinite number of people willing to take up that opportunity because it's a relatively low risk way of making a large amount of money. And you can't change that with policing. You can't. So that's the way to explain it to people, that drug crime is not like other crime. It's only a crime because we've made it a crime. It's not a crime because it's wrong in itself. You know, like theft or assault, those are crimes which are that they're inherently wrong. But a crime which is made wrong because we've prohibited it for moralizing purposes, it's entirely different. Entirely different. And you know, as long as you explain it in those terms, people get it. They do get it. Of course, people will come down to, sometimes people will say, oh, well, just the deterrent isn't good enough. You know, people need to properly fear prison time, or they need to be threatened to be locked up for life. Well, there's lots of evidence that doesn't work either. You know, that's what America have tried. America has 5% of the world's population. They have 25% of the world's prison population. They lock up more than anybody. And they still have the most raging drug war in the wealthy world. So, you know, the evidence is there. Deterrents don't work. We have to change policy.
You know, I think that probably. Have you got anything to add, James?
No, that's good for me.
And the last of the, that's sort of what you and Leap are looking to do then, because obviously what you've outlined for a lot of people might not sound entirely positive in terms of sort of the drug war in this country and obviously globally, but you guys at Leap are looking to try and make changes or influence change where possible.
Yeah, and we are influencing. You know, I've spoken all over the world. I've spoken to cops in LA police headquarters, in California. I've spoken to academics in South Africa. I've spoken in the Danish Parliament. You know, all of the Leap speakers around the world are working really, really hard, and we are having an influence, but we do need support. So please follow us on Twitter, both. So it's at UK Leap. Follow us on Facebook. Support us if you can. Donate if you can, and you know, look for someone to persuade and be part of that social movement.
Could you have pictured yourself doing any of this? Maybe like when you were obviously an undercover cop and you're now obviously an activist for change in that regard?
Oh God, no. I'm an introvert. I don't like going out of my way, having to meet people. I like to hide and read a book. If you'd said to me, you know, 7 years ago, I was going to write a book, voluntarily go into the public eye, meet loads of people, do loads of podcasts, I would have laughed at you because it's quite contrary to my personality. But the thing is, I'm duty bound. That's the thing, because I do understand this and I have the experience experiences and to share with people that will persuade people, then I have to, don't I? I have to do it.
Brilliant. Well, really enjoyed having you on here, and we'll provide the links for all your books and the Leaps Facebook page, Twitter in the description. Remember to subscribe to us on YouTube, iTunes and Podbean, and until next time, take it easy.